In May 2024, after a 7-year public inquiry, the British government was forced to admit something that had been hidden for 40 years, something that destroyed 30,000 lives. The conclusion of the inquiry, published with great ceremony, with carefully chosen words, used 5 phrases that should have shaken this country to its core. It was not an accident. Not an accident. Not a tragedy. Not an unfortunate consequence of limited medical knowledge. A cover-up. Deliberate. Sustained. Across multiple governments. Across multiple decades. But here's the question the mainstream media will not ask. Here's the question that 7 years of inquiry, 23 million pounds, and 40,000 pages of evidence somehow never quite answered. Why? Why did they keep going? Why, when they knew in 1983, when they had the evidence, when they had the safer alternative, when they had every reason to stop? Why did they keep injecting poisoned blood into British citizens for 2 more years? Why did they keep importing from American prisons when they could have sourced from anywhere else? Why did they destroy documents? Why did they silence whistleblowers? Why did they design a compensation scheme specifically to prevent lawsuits? Why, for 40 years, did the British government behave not like an institution that had made a mistake, but like an institution with something to hide? Something so dark that admitting it would be worse than letting people die. This is the contaminated blood scandal. This is what the inquiry found. And this is the theory, the uncomfortable, the disturbing, the defendable theory, that the mainstream media refuses to touch. There is a document at the center of this story, one internal government memo written in 1983 that proves the government knew. But there's another document, one the inquiry didn't publish in full, one that hints at something else entirely. That document, and what it might really mean, is coming, and there's a pattern. A pattern that runs through British public health policy from the 1970s to today. A pattern of who gets protected and who gets sacrificed. When you see that pattern clearly, really clearly, you will never look at the NHS the same way again. That pattern is coming. To understand this scandal, to really understand it, you need to understand one thing about blood. In the 1970s, the NHS began using a new medical product called Factor Thate. Factor Thate was a clotting agent, a treatment for hemophilia. Hemophilia is a condition where blood does not clot properly. A small cut that would be trivial for most people could be life-threatening for a hemophiliac. Before Factor Thate, hemophiliacs lived restricted, anxious lives. Factor Thate changed everything. For the first time, hemophiliacs could live normally. They could play sport. They could have operations. They could stop being afraid of every small injury. It felt like a miracle. It was made from human blood plasma, not from one donor, from thousands. A single batch of Factor Thate could contain plasma from up to 40,000 individual donors, 40,000 people in a single injection, which meant if even one of those 40,000 donors was carrying a blood-borne virus, every patient who received that batch would be exposed. And in the early 1970s, the NHS began importing blood plasma from the United States. Not from voluntary donors like the British system. From paid donors in American prisons. Prisoners who were paid a few dollars for their plasma. Prisoners who had strong financial incentives not to disclose health conditions. Prisoners among whom, in those same years, HIV was spreading silently through intravenous drug use. Now, ask yourself a question. Why? Why import blood from American prisons? Britain has blood donors. Britain has always had blood donors. The British public gives blood freely, generously, every single day. So why, at the very moment when a new, life-saving treatment is being developed, why did the NHS choose the highest risk source on the planet? Why did they choose the one source guaranteed to concentrate blood from the most vulnerable, the most infected, the most desperate population in the Western world? The official answer: cost. American prison plasma was cheap. But let's think about that for a moment. The NHS, the institution charged with protecting British health, chose to save money by using blood from American prisoners. Prisoners who were largely poor. Prisoners who were largely intravenous drug users. Prisoners who, in some facilities, were essentially being farmed, bled regularly for profit. The NHS knew this. The Department of Health knew this, and they did it anyway. But here's where the official story starts to fray, because in the same years, the 1970s and early 1980s, there was another conversation happening. A conversation you won't find in the inquiry report. A conversation about population, about resources, about the burden of chronic illness on the state, about who gets to live and who doesn't. Let's be very precise about what the government knew and when, because this is where the theory begins to take shape. Not in what they didn't know, in what they knew and chose to ignore. By 1982, American medical authorities had already identified that factor VIII was linked to immune deficiency in hemophiliacs. By 1983, the link between contaminated blood products and what was being called AIDS was established in medical literature that the Department of Health was reading. In 1983, a safer method of treating blood products to kill viruses, called heat treatment, was available. Some manufacturers in Germany and America had already switched to heat-treated products. The British government was aware of this. They had a choice: switch to heat-treated products immediately and stop the infections, or continue using the existing supply because heat-treated products cost more, and switching would require admitting that the existing supply had been dangerous. They continued using the existing supply for 2 more years. Between 1983 and 1985, patients in Britain continued to receive untreated blood products, continued to be infected, continued to die. Now, let's do the math. 2 years. 2 years of continued infection. 2 years of knowing, of having the evidence, having the safer alternative, having every reason to stop, and they didn't. Why? The official answer: cost. But that answer crumbles under the slightest pressure, because the cost of treating infected patients, the cost of hospital care, the cost of medication, the cost of dying over months and years instead of living normally, that cost was far higher than switching to heat treatment. The Department of Health, with all its actuaries and economists and planners, knew this. They knew that every infection now meant decades of treatment costs later. They knew that HIV-positive patients would require years of expensive care. They knew that hepatitis C would lead to liver transplants, to chronic illness, to a lifetime of NHS expense. And still, they chose to continue the infections. So if it wasn't about saving money, what was it about? A 1991 internal Department of Health document, released by the 2024 inquiry, showed that officials were aware that around 1,000 hemophiliacs had been infected with HIV through contaminated blood products. 1,000 people known to be infected in an internal document that was not shown to the patients, was not shown to Parliament, was filed away. And the patients, the men, the women, the children who had been given these products by their doctors, by the NHS, by the institution they trusted to keep them healthy, were not told. Many of them did not know they had been infected. They went home. They had relationships. They passed the virus to their partners. Some of those partners died too. Children were born infected. And the government said nothing. But the cover-up, the active, deliberate 40-year cover-up, did not begin with silence. It began with something far more calculated than that. It began with documents. Documents that the inquiry found and then, curiously, chose not to emphasize. In 1983, a senior official in the Department of Health wrote an internal memo. The memo discussed the risk of AIDS transmission through blood products. It discussed the available evidence. It discussed the options available to the government. And it contained a line: recovered by the 2024 inquiry that should have ended careers. The official wrote that switching to safer products would be difficult because it would require acknowledging that patients had already been put at risk. In other words, they knew. They knew the products were dangerous. They knew patients had been infected. And their concern in writing in 1983 was not how to help those patients. Their concern was how to avoid admitting what had happened. That is not negligence. That is not incompetence. That is a deliberate choice. But there is another document, one that the inquiry mentioned, but did not publish in full. A document from 1979, before HIV was identified, before anyone was talking about AIDS. A document about blood product sourcing and population health projections. This document, mentioned in testimony but never released completely, apparently discussed the long-term costs of treating hemophilia. Hemophilia is expensive. The clotting factors, the hospital visits, the specialist care over a lifetime, hemophiliacs cost the NHS significantly more than the average citizen. And in the late 1970s, there was a quiet conversation happening in Whitehall, a conversation about resources, about the growing burden of chronic illness on a strained health service, about the future. One witness, whose testimony was partially redacted, mentioned that in the 1970s, there were discussions about the sustainability of treating certain conditions at current levels. Another, a retired civil servant who spoke to researchers on condition of anonymity, said that in some departments, hemophiliacs were referred to as high-cost patients. Now, let's connect some dots. The NHS chooses to import blood from the highest risk source available, American prisons. They do this despite having a perfectly good voluntary donor system at home. They continue using untested, untreated blood products for 2 full years after safer alternatives exist. They know patients are getting sick, and they don't tell them. They know patients are dying, and they don't stop. They destroy documents. They withhold evidence. They design compensation schemes specifically to prevent lawsuits. And through it all, the hemophiliacs, the high-cost patients, are dying. Dying in numbers that just happen to reduce the long-term burden on the health service. Is that a conspiracy? Or is that just convenient? The inquiry called it a catalog of failures. But failures don't follow a pattern. Failures don't look this much like design. The inquiry found that government documents had been lost, destroyed, and withheld. The inquiry's lead counsel described the destruction of documents as a consistent pattern across multiple government departments over multiple decades. Why destroy documents unless they contain something worth hiding? Why withhold evidence unless it proves something worse than negligence? The inquiry found that ministers had been misled, that patients had been misled, that doctors, some of whom had been given financial incentives by pharmaceutical companies to use certain blood products, had misled their patients. The inquiry found that some patients were used in research trials without being told they were in trials, without consent. Infected patients given experimental treatments without being told they were experimental. Children. Some of the hemophiliacs treated with contaminated products were children. Some were infants, infected as babies. Some died before they were old enough to understand what had happened to them. The 2024 inquiry described the treatment of patients and their families as, and I am quoting directly, a catalog of failures by successive governments, health departments, and the NHS. Not a failure. A catalog, plural, repeated, over decades, by multiple governments of both parties. Now let me ask you a question. When something goes wrong once, that's a mistake. When something goes wrong the same way, over and over for 40 years, across different governments, different departments, different decades, at what point does mistake stop being the right word? At what point do you have to consider that maybe, just maybe, this was working exactly as intended? Let me stop with the documents for a moment and talk about the people. 3,000 dead, 30,000 infected. Those are not statistics. Those are families.
我要想猜测为太不少测试 B， 太不少测试 C， 还找 Z， 而是由other passengers 早一些 offering the transfusion of blood transfusions. Loss 是不是随分出来啊 ？I lost my base my brother's orientation. One person hepatitis C. 在交易的存在是带了在1997.
Gary Webster was a hemophiliac infected with HIV and hepatitis C through NHS treatment in the 1970s. He died in 1992. He was 34. Before he died, he told his family, I just want to know why. Why did the people who were supposed to help me do this to me? His family spent 30 years asking. In 2024, they got their answer. It was not an accident. They still don't know why it happened. Neither does anyone else. Peter Longstaff was given contaminated factor VIII as a child. He developed hepatitis C. He told the inquiry, they told us we were lucky to have the treatment. They told us we should be grateful. They never told us we were being given poison. Thousands of wives and partners were infected by husbands who had received contaminated blood. who had no idea they were infected, who had been told nothing. Women with no risk factors, dying of AIDS because their husbands were given infected blood and never told. Children grew up without fathers. Mothers buried sons. And through all of it, the government denied, delayed, dismissed for 40 years. Victims were told their illness was their own fault, told the risks had been explained, told they were conspiracy theorists. The 2024 inquiry proved all of that was false. The inquiry chair, Sir Brian Langstaff, said the cover-up was not the result of a conspiracy, but of something more corrosive, a culture of not telling patients the truth, not telling Parliament the truth, and not acknowledging what was known. A culture, not one decision, not one minister, not one bad actor. A culture built into British institutions of protecting the institution before protecting the people. But here's the question Sir Brian's report doesn't answer. Who benefits? Who benefits when institutions learn to protect themselves instead of the public? And in this case, specifically, provably in this case, who benefited from 30,000 people infected and 3,000 dead? Because someone always benefits. That's not conspiracy theory. That's just how systems work. Now, the detail I promised. The thing the government did, not in the 1970s or 1980s, but in the 1990s and 2000s. In 1991, the government established a compensation scheme, the McFarlane Trust. The payments were ex gratia, made without admission of legal liability. We'll give you money, but we're not admitting we did anything wrong. The payments were small, far smaller than victims were entitled to. And to receive them, many victims had to sign documents that restricted their legal right to sue the government. Think about that. The government poisoned you, covered it up, watched you get sick. And then, when you asked for help, they said, we'll give you a little money, but only if you promise never to sue us. The cover-up was built into the compensation scheme. For another 30 years, that worked. Now, look at the pattern. 1970s, high-risk blood from American prisons. 1980s, continued use of unsafe products after safer alternatives existed. 1990s, a compensation scheme designed to prevent lawsuits. 2000s, continued denial, document destruction, silence. 2010s, an inquiry that took 7 years and cost £23 million. 2020s, a report that admits it was not an accident, but does not answer why. Why at every single stage did the government choose the option that led to more death, more cover-up? There's a word for that, a word we're not supposed to use. Intentional. What if elements within the government, within the health service, looked at the numbers? The cost of treating hemophiliacs for a lifetime, the growing burden of chronic illness on the NHS, the projections, the actuarial tables, the population models, and made a decision? Not a formal decision. Not a memo you could ever find, but a decision to let high-cost patients, those requiring decades of expensive care, quietly die off. Is that provable? No. But is it defendable as a theory? Given the pattern? Given the choices made at every juncture? Yes. This scandal happened across conservative and labor governments, covered up by both. The decisions were made by civil servants and officials never elected, never removed. The culture that prioritized institutional reputation over human lives was built over decades, in departments where nobody ever faced consequences. 3,000 people died of infections given to them by the NHS. The government knew. They covered it up for 40 years. So the families were told they were wrong, told they were conspiracy theorists, told to stop asking. They were not wrong. And the only reason we know any of this is because those families refused to stop asking, refused to accept the payments without admission, refused to be silenced. If this video has made you angry, good. Remember that anger. Not to distrust every institution blindly, but to never stop asking questions. Because this scandal was not ended by a government decision. It was ended by people, ordinary people, who would not stop. In May 2024, after 40 years, the inquiry published its report. 5 words: it was not an accident. 3,000 people died to prove those 5 words. Their families spent 40 years fighting to hear them. But here's the question they're still asking. If it wasn't an accident, what was it? The inquiry doesn't say. The government won't say. The media won't ask, but the pattern is there. The deaths are there. And the question that will not go away: at what point does a culture of cover-up become something else? At what point does letting people die when you could save them become something that looks very much like intent? If you or your family were affected, contact the Infected Blood Compensation Authority or the Haemophilia Society. Subscribe for more hidden British history, because the most important stories are almost always the ones they took the longest to admit. And sometimes, just sometimes, the ones they're still hiding.